that sound okay?
Yep.
Okay. So this past week, it was kind of a twofer as far as the church year calendar goes. It was National Lutheran Schools Week, but it was also Life Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
So Life Sunday, where you focus in on sanctity of human life, concerns, issues in our own theology, our own faith, but also in response to kind of where American culture is today, you know. And we opted to go with the emphasis being on National Lutheran Schools Week. It was the kickoff for that week, and it's kind of hard to have two emphases at the same time. But this month, actually the whole month of January, is an emphasis on life issues. Okay, so what I thought we could do, even though, you know, we're coming out of January into February, I thought, well, let's just go ahead then and talk about some of those issues. And I think this format is really, in some ways, better for it anyway. You know, you get a sermon, and you're like, it can give the impression, basically, in a sermon that, like, sanctity of human life, concerns or issues in Lutheran theology basically boils down to don't get an abortion. You know, I don't know why it always ends up that way in a sermon, but it kind of
there's only so much you can fit into a sermon.
It's 20 minutes, and you gotta
and you're not going to preach on 4 different topics within that 20 minutes. And this space gives us a lot of opportunity to dive into it.
We can explore this, yeah.
And when I think about sanctity of human life, I mean, I think fundamentally first just the point that we have life because God's given us life.
Yeah,
that certainly covers abortion and our views on abortion and how we look at that.
But it
covers so many other things too.
It's not just that though. Like It's so much more than that. And I think that's the right starting place, that we have life because God's given us life. Because I think especially today, with the politicization of literally everything, like I swear it's so. And I'm actually used to this kind of weirdness because I'm from the South. So we've done this for generations over something like racism. Like in Memphis, where I was serving before I came here, you could walk out into the street and spit on the yellow line and somebody would take that as a racial, like, jab or
overtones.
Yeah, that it had some sort of overtone. Because the town was so charged from so many generations of deep hurt that they took everything and ran it through the lens of race. And racism is a real problem, like it's a real thing. But not everything that somebody does has some sort of racial overtone to it. But in that town, everything became about that lens to view everything. So, and I feel that way about so many parts of American culture today. Everything's so politicized now that you think you're talking to somebody about theology, but what they hear is politics.
Well, and
so when we talk about sanctity of human life from the standpoint of the Lutheran faith and what it means to Christian religion, I think some people immediately think we're talking about whatever is the headline of whatever case is being heard. Like they think it's immediately about politics or something like that. And for Lutherans, it's not. For Lutherans, this is a deeply theological topic.
Well, and I want to say one other thing before we dive more into the theology, but when you say politicization of the politics of it, really for me, and I come out of working from politics, before I came into this role here, and to me it's much more the divisiveness. It gets played out in a political way many times, but it's the divisiveness, and it's the divisiveness very much that's binary. Yeah. Either you're with me or you're against me.
Right. It's us versus them. It's tribalism. It's all that stuff.
There's no nuance. There's no
nuance. What's that? Just bludgeon the other guy over the head.
There's no nuance. There isn't space for discussions about, well, I think this, but I think this, and how do we find some sort of common ground, or how do we speak to each other in a way that respects somebody else's opinion, or recognizes that, even using your example from Memphis, that maybe there's some really deep psychological scars and psychological associations of why everything gets tied to racism so quickly.
Right.
Those feelings might be real. It doesn't necessarily mean it's about racism.
What I'm trying to say with that example in a different arena is that I realize that there are legitimate reasons why people end up going where they go.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that it's correct.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like, I get it, but I also get that it's not correct.
But that using that as an example, it kind of helps paint a picture of what I mean by nuance of saying, rather than just saying you're wrong, that's not racist. Maybe
which is in the history of everything has always been so helpful to say to somebody,
say you're wrong.
You're wrong. That's not racist. And the same thing is true of life issues. Yeah. You're wrong. We're not trying to come at you to coerce everybody to look at the world our way or something like that. This isn't about power over the neighbor. In a lot of ways, the general topic of life issues, in where it sits within the Lutheran theology, right? Because Lutheran theology is this thick thing, right? It all hangs together. It's 500 years old since Luther. It's much older than that, going back through the Roman Catholic tradition that predated it and all of that. So you're talking about a thick body of theology
that rests on Scripture,
right? And where life topics fit within that overall theology, it is in a place actually of service to the neighbor. Like that's like it's not about trying to have power over the neighbor. Where it sits within Lutheran thought is that topics that are related to issues that have to do with life and the sanctity of human life, it actually sits in a place within the theology of service, not of coercion. And that's what I mean when I'm trying to bring in other examples of where our society's at. Everything's broken down into tribalism, and everything has to do with us versus them. And that's so not what Lutherans are trying to say. But I feel like the increasing challenge today, and I think it's a challenge to us as Christian men and women. Like, meaning rise to the challenge.
How are we going to show up to our neighbor?
How are we going to show up to our neighbor? How are we going to talk about this in a way that makes sense to the other person, to try to bridge that gap and stop talking past the wider culture and where they're at on some things, and try to meet somewhere where there can be this gospel moment. Everybody knows what it looks like to bludgeon someone over the head. Everybody knows what it looks like to yell. Everybody knows what it looks like to throw stones. What I'm looking for is a place where there's a gospel moment.
Well, let's unpack that a little bit. And I'm just going to talk about abortion for a second.
Yeah.
You're using that as something probably everybody's listened to is pretty well versed on what it is, maybe how you feel about it, but seeing it as a gospel moment. So, we live within a context for our beliefs where, belief that life begins at conception. From my mother's womb I've known you, the very hairs of your head are numbered. Again, life is something that God's given us. Mm-hmm. So we believe very fundamentally, very strongly that child is a child in the womb. That's God's child. Mm-hmm. That he has plans for them, that he knows what those plans are. And so, and I think for each of us maybe too, it's easy to have that visceral reaction of how could somebody have an abortion? How could they think that it's okay? Or how do you justify this evil, horrible thing? And if you're looking at someone that doesn't share that same belief, that's an atheist.
Yeah, they're not starting from the
same standpoint of life begins at conception.
Right.
And so if we start out right at the point of saying, well, we should change the law, abortion should be illegal, or we should do this, it becomes power over your neighbor because it becomes, for what they're going to hear then again is you're telling a woman what she has to do with her body.
Yeah, that's how it's going to get heard. Yeah.
And not what's intended.
Right.
Not what we believe as Lutherans, that we want to tell a woman what she has to do with her body. But it's how it's going to be heard. And so then, right. Just thinking about it from the standpoint of how do you then maybe start that conversation, or look for ways to open up dialogue that doesn't come across as I'm trying to control you.
Now you've had these kinds of conversations with people.
Coming from working in the world of politics and knowing folks that are
you're working with people in that environment, in that political spectrum here in Nebraska, where you're at state level politics. So you're working with people who do not share your view of the world. You're working with people who hold very different beliefs than you. Like what was a time that you had a conversation with somebody on one of these related topics to life issues that where you felt like there was a bridge being built on some level?
I remember having a conversation with she's a female. I'm not going to say a name necessarily, but one time, and it was really one of those where it kind of started out as we both she was pro-choice, I'm pro-life.
Yeah,
pretty clear about that. started the conversation that way. But I was like, well, let's unpack a little bit of what that means for each of us. And sometimes I do it by asking questions of, tell me a little bit about this. And in this conversation in particular, I remember getting to a point of just kind of walking through it and really just starting from this perspective of I just see this as that's a life in the womb.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think it's fair for me as a Christian that I should put myself in a spot to decide whether or not that child in the womb should live or die.
Mm-hmm.
And this person was coming from the perspective of like, well, I just think it's a fetus, it's not actually a life.
Mm-hmm.
And then I kind of walked him through a series of questions that I remember getting to the point with asking them, would you be okay with making a decision that would stop the possibility of life occurring?
Mm-hmm.
And they finally got to the point that there's almost like this light bulb moment for them a little bit, where they started to see a little bit where I was coming from.
Mm-hmm.
This glimpse of, okay, now I see what you're saying. And they were only willing to admit to the fact that it was the potential of a human life.
Mm-hmm.
But they were admitting that they were stopping the potential of a human life.
Mm-hmm.
But again, it was just a matter of just having a conversation that was really non-judgmental, letting them say whatever they wanted to say, sharing what I said, asking questions, but not trying to pigeonhole them, not trying to push them into a corner, not trying to bludgeon them over the head with anything, but really just, I'm just here to talk to you. I'm going to share what I think, but I'm going to do so in a way that's really non-judgmental.
Yeah.
That's really open to the fact that...
Well, okay, to be fair, though, we as Christians always say that we're non-judgmental, but that's not how we're coming across to the rest of the world, right? Like, we always, we're not judgmental, but then they hear us as judgmental. I think one of the reasons that is that when someone expresses a view to you that you find detestable...
Abhorrent,
yeah. Right. It's hard... I think sometimes to check your own gut, check your own emotional reaction, and to let them say what the world looks like from their perspective. But but if you believe that our enemies, as Paul teaches us, that our enemies are not other human beings, that our enemies are powers, principalities, all this stuff, that it's about spiritual warfare, then that means that this person I'm having this discussion with, who they have their own place that they're coming from, they're not my enemy, right? So I'm not trying to... So when they say something that I find personally abhorrent, I'm not going to assign that to them. If that makes sense what I'm saying. I'm not going to assign that feeling to them and make them my problem. My problem is how I'm feeling right now. So I'm going to have to process that for myself, right? But if I'm really interested in what the world looks like to this other person, I've got to allow them to say what it really looks like, or I'm never going to get an honest answer out of this person.
Or to give them space to just talk about how they feel. One of the ways I've
like, what does it feel like to be you?
One of the ways I've tried to conceptualize it in having these kind of conversations before, and to try to think about how could I put myself in their shoes,
right,
is imagine a world, right now we're in the spot where...
That kind of sounds like a movie trailer. Imagine a world.
Imagine a world.
Sorry, go ahead.
This is not an exciting world that I'm going to...
Yeah, it's not exciting. Well, I mean, there are movies like that.
Yeah.
So, imagine a dystopian world. Okay.
But, we're post Roe v. Wade, where abortion's legal.
And for a really long time now.
A really long time.
Yeah.
But I put myself in the headspace of what if the world went to a point where you had forced abortions, where there are laws in the books about, you think about China and, what they've done some with
population control.
Population control, only wanting a male maybe over a female.
Yeah.
And how I would feel if you go to your doctor and your wife's pregnant and they're like, yeah, you can't have this baby.
Mm-hmm.
And how incredibly upset I would be.
If we're getting these kids, like,
I
love being at a school because there's always something going on.
Yeah.
But then, like, if y'all are hearing the kids just running, it's because they're doing recess right now.
Yeah.
But yeah, so.
But imagining that idea.
It's supposed to be this moment of joy for you and your spouse, and instead you get to the doctor's office and they say, yeah, but this doesn't fit our state's control over your... You want to talk about control over your body?
Yeah.
Our state's control over your reproduction, right? And so you're not going to be allowed to
can't
have
this child. And somebody that's that's an atheist that's really staunchly pro-choice, that thinks it's about women's choice over a body, that's how they're going to feel. If you just come in and say abortion's wrong, you're wrong.
Right.
You're going to make them feel like the way I would feel if I got told I couldn't have the kid I wanted to have.
Exactly.
And so trying to then, if we're not serving over our neighbor, but serving in a way that's under our neighbor, to show up for them, to show the love of Christ, maybe you got to give space to those feelings. Maybe you got to give space to the fact that they're in a completely different spot.
Yeah.
And it doesn't make it okay. Because abortion's wrong. Let's not kid ourselves. But
well, I think there's probably room here then to talk about a little more in depth, other than God gave us life.
Okay.
As to what Christians traditionally are basing that belief on. I mean, I could be as sarcastic and as glib as the next person and say there's nothing magical about the birth canal. It's not that they weren't a person, they passed through the magical birth canal and now they're out and now they're a person, for a number of reasons. Number one, that's not helpful, and it furthers the tribalism and the us versus them mentality. But number two, it's not helpful because there are states right now that are considering laws that would allow for babies to be born, kept alive for a certain period of time before then they are aborted, because that live fetus that's had a couple more weeks to develop is now worth a bunch more money in spare parts. People don't realize what's going on with this industry. Like, it's an industry.
Yes.
And they've turned human beings into a factory for spare parts. But we can get to that later. But they're going to be worth more than if they were aborted in utero. And so the glib comment about the magic of the birth canal doesn't work anymore on a number of levels, not the least of which is that some people on the other side of an issue like abortion are getting increasingly bold about their desire to see these human beings harvested later so that they can make more money. And that's really what this is about at that point. It's about money.
Practical reality of how they're trying to look at an aborted baby to use it for medical research purposes or whatever
or whatever it is. But so and so there's a lot to this on that level. But going back to why do Christians? Because this is a long held belief by Christians that life is a gift. And I think we have to start with the scriptures, right? And the stories of God's people going all the way back to the beginning. But in my mind, the first place I always go. Because we're a storied people, right? We're the people of a particular story. We have a particular narrative of how we believe God created the world and how God has worked in the world to save the world from itself, and I go back to Abraham, right, and Sarah. So in the beginning, God created the world out of nothing, and then later down the road, God comes to this dude, Abram, right? Who's going to get known by Abraham later, and he's living in what is today northern Iraq, right? He's from Haran, and he's from what is today northern Iraq, and he says, "Go to the land I'll show you, and I'm going to turn you into a great nation. I'm going to make you a people." He's talking to a dude and his wife who are so old that they're already past their childbearing years. Okay? There are no Jews, there are no Hebrews, there's no Israelites, there's no Israelis, I don't care what you want to call the people from Canaan. Okay? Those people do not exist. God is going to make this people, Hebrews, Jews, whatever you want to call them, He's going to make this people out of this one man and his wife, Abraham and Sarah. But they're already too old to have children. So once again, God is enjoying creating out of nothing. He's going to create an entire people out of nothing. Okay? So He created the world out of nothing and created an entire people out of nothing. And the story of how He keeps that promise shows us that life is not a matter of pure biology, right? Gametes and right? It's life is a matter of it stands or falls by the word of God alone. right? This story that we live by as Christians is a story where life is not our prerogative. As much as think about the medical industry. We try to evade death. We try to prolong life. We try to improve the quality of life of persons. We try to. But at the end of the day, I'm for all that stuff, right? Because I don't want to die of an infected toothache like our pioneer ancestors, right, or whatever. So I don't want to die needlessly of something that was easily avoidable, and yet we have to admit that at the end of the day, there's a certain amount of a desire to control life at that point. Same thing, and this is touchy because I don't want to burden anybody who's struggled with infertility. Me and my wife have struggled with infertility, but some of the ways that people try to get around infertility is kind of skirts that line a little bit with control. At the end of the day, life is God's prerogative, And so there's a story that we tell each other over and over again that goes all the way back to examples like Abraham and Sarah, where we believe in a God who creates life out of nothing. And that life is, at the end of the day, his prerogative, not ours. And that's the starting place, I think, for where Lutherans get this crazy idea that life is a sacred gift, like on the level of spirituality and divinity. Well, and can't be co-opted, messed with. It's deeply immoral to us, like we said, abhorrent, the idea. But that's where it starts to come from. We are a people of a particular story, and we believe that God has acted definitively in human history in certain ways, and that's what gives rise to these beliefs.
Well, and I think maybe to speak on that in a different lens of it too, but you talk about your family with infertility a little bit, and even for Tiffany and I going through various iterations of we've got two great kids, and we've got 2 kids that we lost.
Yeah,
correctly.
You've got
For me, walking through those different circumstances, the ones that didn't go well, in my mind at least, versus the kids that we have, and for me, it floored me in a way to put a perspective on it. One, there's this utter helplessness that I really have no control over life itself at all.
Yeah, no.
And also just the amazing, how fragile life is.
Mm-hmm.
In our hands,
it's crazy.
How much the doctors try
life
to do.
Is so resilient. We say things like life will find a way, right? Life is so resilient and it's so strong, and yet what's weird is that it is so fragile.
As many things as doctors tried to do to save the 2 kids we lost, and it floored me in the sense of how helpless I am, and how fragile life is.
Yeah.
But then the kids that were born and they're healthy now that we still have, it amazed me and floored me again in a different way of reminding me that this truly is an amazing gift that God's given. Mm-hmm. My wife and I, to have 2 wonderful kids, and it just wouldn't work any other way. There's nothing I could do to make it somehow happen.
Mm-hmm.
And
we don't talk that way as a society right now.
No.
There's nothing I could do to make it happen. We talk a different way. Well, we're trying, and if you've said that before, I swear I'm not trying to make fun of you, but I get tickled. I get tickled at that idea, we weren't going, and now we're trying, and it's like we think we have all this control. Why don't you just have fun practicing making a baby? You know what I mean? That's good for your marriage. Why don't you have fun practicing? And why don't you put it in prayer? And when God wants to bless you, he'll bless you. And hold on a little lighter. And again, I know this sounds like hippy-dippy mystical talk to people who don't share our beliefs, but I want to be transparent as a Christian, especially in this kind of a format like a podcast, where we're able to say, look, that's the point. This is a spiritual thing for Christians. It's not just about atoms and cells, and it's spiritual to us. We believe life is sacred. And you know what? The wider imagination of the society on some level does believe that life is a miracle, because if they didn't, you can't have the Lion King and Mufasa and lift it, the circle of life. You can't have any of that in the wider imagination of the society, of the culture, unless there's some grain in that wider culture that does still believe on some level that there is something spiritual and sacred going on here.
And I think that's informative for us in the sense of, as we're walking together as brothers and sisters in Christ, as we're walking together as Christians, as we're walking together as believers with this lens on what life is.
Yeah. When
we really get to it about boots on the ground, when we're talking about life issues. Mm-hmm. That could be abortion, that could be euthanasia, that could be how we're able to care for people
getting old,
getting old, and how you care for your elders,
Alzheimer's. In fact, what I'd like to do? I'd like to do a second part to this.
Okay.
And I'd like for us to move away from the abortion talk and move into some of these other areas. Because, let's just take something just for example, just real quick, just to maybe to whet the appetite. If I'm working with an elderly couple and they've been married for a lot of years and one of them now has Alzheimer's, sometimes the other spouse who's still relatively well in their health will confess things to me like, Pastor, I don't know what to do. I feel so guilty. Well, why do you feel guilty? I'll ask them, and then they'll say, I feel guilty because I prayed that they would just go ahead and die. And I feel that's where the rubber meets the road on life issues. And then what are they supposed to do with the fact that they had these feelings? I'd like for us to maybe do a part 2 to this and move into some of those other life issues. But
or somebody that's waiting for an organ transplant, and there has to be
somebody else has to die so that you have to live.
Yep.
The funny thing is that's our religion.
Yes.
Somebody had to die so that but that's not a joke, because first of all, it's not a joke with Jesus down on the cross, but it's not a joke either from the standpoint that that your best day as a transplant recipient was some other family's worst day.
Yep.
And what do you do with that kind of knowledge? So
and it takes me back when I say the boots on the ground example, and there could be life chain events and protests, and you can write, obviously, elected leaders. There's things even our synod does, I think, pretty well in terms of some advocacy on life-related
our
issues.
denomination is out front and center. We're way out front when it comes to advocacy for life issues. Yeah.
But when I think about it, when just a practical standpoint, if I'm just living my lilife and I get a chance to talk to a neighbor, I get a chance, like I did in my previous vocation, talking to somebody I was working with or whatever it happens to be, is it takes me back to that point I was describing about being floored in having my own kids.
Right.
And that you show up to somebody with humility. You show up to somebody in this utter kind of reverence for the fact that God's amazing, and God's given us all these different things.
Let's talk. Maybe we could make the connection here. If we really believe what we say that we believe about life as a gift and people are made in the image of God, then that means that the person that I'm tempted to be angry with because they hold this other view that I find abhorrent, I think I need to remember that person is similarly sacred because they're alive and because they were made in the image of God. And the truth I'm trying to share with them is a truth that will set them free. But it will be the truth that sets them free, not me.
Yep.
Right? There has to be a humility in how we approach others, that this is about Jesus, it's not about me, and it's about this person being set free by the truth. It's not about them acquiescing to my point of view.
Yep.
And I think if that's a viewpoint we can take, even for a moment, like faith like a mustard seed. Like if we can remember that view, even for a moment, I think it changes the way that we approach this conversation with others. So let's come back to this in a part 2.
I like that.
And we'll talk about some other life issues. But what I hope you walk away with today is the understanding that there's a deep rootedness for this understanding of life as a sacred gift from God that's rooted in our scriptures and in the basic sacred story of how we, even as a people, as Christ's body, how His church even came into being in the first place. That there's a mystery to life in that sense. And so this is a deeply theological issue for Lutherans. It is not primarily a political issue, but rather a theological one. And if that's where we can start, then we can pick it up with a part 2 next time.
Sounds good.
Cool. All right, we'll see you next time.